Back then, he asked us, why am I invited to an architectural school? Why are architects interested in my way of thinking? But obviously, then immediately did a fantastic lecture about Paris and the Polyopticon. So then, of course, nobody asks the question anymore why he's interesting for architecture. I think he influenced a whole generation of us, and beyond the discipline, of course. So I'm very happy to introduce Bruno Latour again, and we're looking forward to a fantastic lecture and hopefully a very good discussion afterwards. Right, thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm prefacing this talk with this Saraceno's work of art in the Biennale in Venice, because it's a solution, an interesting solution to a debate I have with Peter Sloterdijk on spheres and network. And as you can see, it's possible to have spheres and networks and spheres made of networks in the same work of art. What I'm going to talk today is a very obscure topic I'm the only one interested in, and it's pretty bizarre, but there are pictures, so I know when I talk with architects, you always have to have pictures. And there will be lots of pictures. If my talk is disconnected, it's just because I'm trying to interest architects for a long time now to a question of visualization of a space which is not the usual res extensa space. So I might, we'll see if it works. I want to preface this with an episode of a thing I organized last June in Paris, when I asked several people to reenact the debate that Einstein and Bergson had together in 1922. The whole thing is on the website of Pompidou Center. And reenactment, as you know from many works of artists, especially in Britain, Rod Dickinson, is a very powerful way of reopening philosophical and artistic questions. And in this reenactment, we try to redo a debate that had not worked very well in the 1922, because Bergson was the biggest philosopher of France, quite old at the time, was dismissed by Einstein, who was, of course, Einstein of relativity theory, as talking nonsense, basically, or talking less than nonsense, that is, psychology. And in the first debate in 1922, Bergson spoke for half an hour, and then for 5 minutes, Bergson said, forget it, this is not really interesting. You are not talking about anything that could interest physicists. You are talking about subjective and psychological time. I, physicist, Einstein, speaks about real time and space. And of course, this debate was so bad for Bergson that everyone, including Bergson, strangely enough, thought that he had lost. And the idea of reenacting it in last year in Pompidou Center was based on the idea that is it possible, after almost a century, given the new question we raise around space and time because of the ecological crisis, to reenact the debate to give a chance to Bergson? You might be surprised to see that there is Olafur Eliasson there, and that was a very strange idea. I asked Olafur to referee the debate, and one philosopher, Elie During, who is a very good specialist of Bergson, to invent a debate which was correct scientifically and philosophically, but which was, of course, impossible because Einstein actually was listening to what Bergson had said. And that, of course, was a fiction. So there is an Einstein in 1922, so to speak, a Zweistein of 210, and this Zweistein is actually speaking. The thing is in French, so I don't want to show the thing to you, but just the setup where Einstein is played with a very nice Yiddish German accent by Bernard Blistein, and where Bergson is played by Elie During. If we had made the debate so that actually Einstein would have deferred to Bergson and said, yes, Mr. Bergson, you're right, and I'm wrong, it would have been ridiculous. It would have been a fiction and not a reenactment. What Elie During did, and it was a much more clever way, it was a draw, so to speak. What we wanted is a draw. That is, at the end of the talk, instead of Einstein saying, you, like he said in the original dialogue, that's the end of Einstein's terse comment, hence there is no philosopher's time, there is only a psychological time different from the time of a physicist. The physicist owns time, and you philosophers, and of course artists and politicians and whoever else, you just talk about psychology and subjective time. But you can't have an argument about time. Bergson, of course, was convinced, except he was very worried by this conclusion of this debate, that actually he was talking cosmology, not psychology. He was not talking about the lived time and letting Einstein have the real time. He was talking about cosmology. He wanted a cosmological argument, not a psychological argument. And in the debate, as it has been redrawn by Elie During, we arrive at the end where Einstein has not exactly to confess, but to admit that he has a metaphysics of time, and that Bergson has another metaphysics of time. So we try to make the thing slightly more equal. Again, a draw, not, of course, a victory for Bergson, which would have been a falsification of history. But 1 century later, it's quite interesting to try to think if it's possible to have real time, the time of Bergson as duration, as a cosmological principle, not as a psychology element. This is the prologue of my argument. My argument is in 3 parts. Just very briefly, I want to review some of the results of the work which has been done on materialism. It's very difficult to be materialist. I think architects know that very well. And the second part is around this question of things and objects, and trying to use this expression I've introduced of matters of concern and matters of fact. And the third is trying to find a few examples to interest you in the discussion. How can we overcome or find another alternative to the extension of the res extensa? Res extensa is the technical term in pedantic Latin for the Euclidean space in which we are supposed to live in, except, not, as I show, none of us live in it. So the summary of the previous episode is that what we call materialism, materiality, is in fact an idealistic version of what matter is about. So we should in fact never speak of res extensa in the Cartesian argument. People always say Descartes made the wrong move and made the res extensa different from the res cogitans, but this is not true. Descartes actually fought the res extensa. He fought the res extensa. Res extensa is matter understood by the res cogitans. So we should really talk about res extensa cogitans. There is no object, there is no element of matter that ever was, ever resided in res extensa. So what Descartes did was not a division. It was, on the contrary, an enormous extension of a res cogitans, thinking, one could even say dreaming of a res extensa. And the best way, I think, to summarize this long argument, which has been made in the book by Daston and Gallison about objectivity and in much of my own work, is this beautiful print by Jeff Wall, which summarizes a whole scenography of the first, what I call the first empiricism. Empiricism is not the only way to relate to the world. We all know that from phenomenology, Merleau-Ponty, etc., etc. But it has a very interesting history, art history aspect, which is a certain type of light, northern light, a certain type of position. You see that the way, the drawing and a sort of meditative mood, the distance, never a big distance, it's always small, 50 centimeters, 60 centimeters. The limb is at the equal level. It has a whole scenography of distance and proximity, and of course it's a dead limb. And the big problem is to jump from the dead limb to the paper. Now, of course, none of us has really this experience. I mean, we can have this experience, but it's a very, very limited, highly framed, highly staged determination of what it is to be in contact with experience. And not only because the thing is a dead limb. So, empiricism, the way res cogitans or res extensa cogitans was introduced, I'm afraid, by the Brits very largely, by Locke, largely actually. Locke was very interested in drawings, as you know, and in the whole metaphor of print, is a very, very segmented view of what it is to stand, for things to stand in the world. But of course, this very, very limited view is inside the drawing itself. It's not the way the word is like. Because, of course, it has no connection with science. I mean, the fact that empiricism always used science as its resources has absolutely no connection with the practice of science. And this is here just one little piece to remind you of some of the things we learn from science studies. I mean, the practice of science has nothing to do with being seated with looking at things at some distance with a northern light and trying to make it jump from the thing to the paper. It's a highly activated, it's a highly instrumentalized, it's a very much, it's a choreography which has been studied now by many people, and I don't have to belabor the point. But it is a way of drawing. And of course, I don't need to argue the point with architect. I mean, it is a way of drawing, or more exactly in drawing, by using a vocabulary which has been magnificently defined by William Ivins almost 60 years ago in his work, where he says, the most marked characteristic of European pictorial representation since the 14th century have been, on the one hand, its steadily increasing naturalism, like the one in Jeff Wall's print, and on the other, its purely schematic and logical extension. It's submitted that both are due in largest part to the development and pervasion of method, which have provided symbols repeatable in invariant form, what I've called immutable mobile, for representation of visual awareness, and a grammar of perspective, which made it possible to establish logical relation not only within the system of symbol, but between that system and the forms and location of the object that it symbolized. Of course, Ivan here is commenting the history of the print in 15th century, but all of you who work on CAD design and all of us who work on screens have basically the same experience of an extension of this vocabulary, of this schematic and grammar of perspective when we are used to rotate beautiful design in your own studio. Now, of course, no one could imagine that this is the way the buildings themselves stand, or that object in the world stand, if they were, that is, in their right mind. We all know that the way we draw, the possibility of staying and modifying and keeping in variance a lot of the elements of the drawing, is a fabulous invention. It's a fabulous invention to keep precisely the constant, but it cannot be taken as the way the things actually stands. And even though, of course, in technical drawing, masses of work has been made possible, especially though it has been studied many times, the way the work is ordered, the way organizations are made, the way you can delegate activity to other people, all of those elements are extremely important, but again, they are not an element in the word. Or more exactly, they add to the word, but they are not what withdraw from the word other type of capacity. And of course, the great philosopher who has seen that beautifully in a work which is difficult to read, but nonetheless extremely important for this argument, Whitehead in The Concept of Nature, has very well stated this very bizarre philosophical phenomenon that transformed drawing and perspective drawing, or more exactly engineering drawing, into the definition of matter, the most idealistic definition of what matter is. Thus, what is a mere procedure of mind, that could be a translation of Ivan's point before, in the translation of sense awareness into discursive knowledge, has been transmuted into a fundamental character of nature. In this way, matter has emerged as being the metaphysical substratum of its property and the course of nature interpreted as the history of matter. So matter for Whitehead, and the whole concept of nature is built on that, and then later, of course, process and reality, much even more difficult work to read, is that matter is a conflation of two completely different ideas. One of them is what he called the passage of nature, and what Bergson could call duration, even though they are different between the two. And something entirely different is the way we draw, the way we access in drawing the possibility of maintaining the constant by drawing it with the grammar that Ivins has described earlier. And this is why for Whitehead we had this argument which has occupied a long part of history of philosophy, and actually not only of philosophy, but as I have shown elsewhere, but I won't go into that, the political epistemology as well, is this distinction between primary qualities and secondary qualities. As if we had on one side the primary quality, you all know that, which are real. This is primaries, they are real, they are invisible. They are known by science, but you don't know how they are known by science. The science is not there physically, they are there as a voice from nowhere. And they have no meaning, no lived meaning, no ethical meaning, but they are, of course, objective. And on the other side, there are secondary qualities, which are unfortunately unreal, have lots of sense, are visible, but they are only superficially true. Of course, the architects are very well aware of that, because this philosophical argument, which comes from Locke, and which has been undone, according to Whitehead, by William James, and Whitehead himself, is reorganized and relived every time an architect meets an engineer. The very connection of the architect with an engineer actually redo constantly this drama of a link between primary quality and secondary quality. So architects are especially attuned to this history of philosophy part. But of course, nature itself has not really bifurcated. So Whitehead argument in the, and it's a long quote, I'm sorry, but I needed to make the point in a philosophical, or to remind you of the philosophical import which is behind the argument around basically primary and secondary quality, is a sort of mistake, if mistake is an understatement, about what the word is made of. As if we had mixed two completely, in the notion of matter, two entirely different aspects. The way we know it and the way it actually passes. Matter represents the refusal to think away spatial and temporal characteristic and to arrive at the bare concept of an individual entity. And of course, the whole book later by Whitehead on process and reality tries to find an alternative to that. It's this refusal which has caused the muddle, and muddle is a very powerful word, muddle of importing the mere procedure of thought into the fact of nature, as if nature was behaving in the way we draw on a CAD design. The entity bared of all characteristics except those of space and time has acquired a physical status as the ultimate textures of nature. And that's a famous sentence by Whitehead, so that the course of nature is conceived as being merely the fortunes of matter in its adventure for space. The political import here is, of course, of no interest for Whitehead, but you understand very easily that in the divide between primary and secondary quality, there is also a very, very strong point of political epistemology. Primary quality are invisible, real, known only by science, but they have a great advantage of putting all of us in agreement. And we are divided by the secondary quality, ethical value and so on, which have a big inconveniences of being unreal. So of course there is, in the very divide, and of course it's not by mistake that Locke has invented, or at least seized upon the possibility of a primary and secondary quality to build its own politics and its own economic theory, is that once you have a primary secondary quality divide, you can organize the polity in a very nice way. If only we all were only primary quality, if only we had access only to a primary quality, we would be in agreement. Unfortunately, the subjectivity is multiple. And that's how the great scenography of the political epistemology of mono-naturalism and multiculturalism or multi-spirituality or subjectivity was invented. This is not what Whitehead says. Whitehead is a great philosopher, but not about politics. But you see the import for us, now for us meaning people now in this century, where of course the big question is what the ecology, how can we in an ecological crisis rethink the cosmology of space and time, and not only add secondary quality to primary quality. So this was just a quick reminder, I'm sorry for those who know already these things, but of a large body of work, history of philosophy and visualization. Basically, the whole question of philosophy of a primary and secondary quality is now part of art history. And I can send you to Objectivity, again, by Gallison and Daston as a very important book on that. But of course, nature itself has not bifurcated. Bifurcation is a philosophical conceit, not to say concept. It's impossible for nature to bifurcate. There would be no organism if nature had bifurcated for good, as if we could distinguish between primary and secondary quality. But the difficulty, and I think that's why architect is so interesting, and architectural theory sits on a very interesting thing, because architectural theory is never taken extremely seriously by philosophers, which is good. Because it's like design, all of these little things where people are not taken seriously, but where the problem is actually activated very seriously every day in the practice. What matter is made of if it's not res extensa? And if it's not just a combination of primary quality and secondary quality. As Whitehead says in this beautiful expression, when a secondary quality, red, is given into experience, what else is given also? So there is, inside architectural theory, and inside architectural theory, the debate between architect and engineer is an ideal place for raising, again, a question, not of form and function, which is the most boring question ever raised, but the other question, what cosmologically the word of matter is made of. Part two, the easy part. Well, if it's true that res extensa carries is not the way, it's something which is in the drawing, an organized connection between drawings in the general sense of visualizing and allowing constant to remain constant through this grammar of connection that Ivan spoke in the quote before. How can we actually detect the difficulty of object, of things in the etymological sense, matters of concern is the word I now use, to stand in this word? Not, I hope you understand, it's not a phenomenological point where how do we add a lived interpretation to these things which are in res extensa. No, it's exactly the opposite. How can res extensa extend everywhere, in quotation mark, if it's true that it's actually a very local, highly defined, extremely specialized, technological mediated idiom to speak of connection between constants. That's the problem I want to present. And for that, I just want to present a few cases where it's very clear that these matters of concern don't stand inside the res extensa. Well, it's quite simple for religious mediation. I've studied that a lot. It's quite interesting to see that when there's a whole body of literature now in art history on that, but the up and down of the pictures on the left has nothing to do with, of course, the movement inside the Euclidean space. It's slightly less clear on the painting on the right. And of course, it's much less clear here, which is a fusion of religious theme and Cap Kennedy type of rockets moving up. The up here is very difficult to recode it as a religious up. Heaven is become mixed with sky here. And of course, sky is something in which religious figures and religious spirituality is hard to breathe. It's very difficult to make a Virgin Mary breathe in the sky. In heaven, it works, but in skies, how do you move? And you can add a lot of angels propping it up and boosting, so to speak, boosters and rockets and clouds and all sorts of things. There is something that doesn't actually carry, so to speak, if I can say that, the Virgin Mary in a religious sense. And there's a whole history, of course, that the Baroque movement is trying to do. But still, it's very clear that when you talk about religious element, religious entity, they have no room in the Euclidean space. Now, of course, this is, people would say, yes, of course, religious have no room there because they are unreal. But of course, the same thing with buildings, as you very well know. And I just take two examples of that vast literature that you know, of course, much better than me, on the fact that buildings themselves don't stand in res extensa for lots of reasons. One of them is that they are being built and never actually visible simultaneously, except by little oligoptica on the screen of your CAD design. There is an interesting book by Mario Carpo on the architecture in the age of printing, when he makes the interesting point that even when perspective was invented and came to large usage, actually every drawn building was locally. It was not actually connected by a same res extensa. And he made the troubling point for Descartes' argument that during the perspective, invention of perspective, especially when printing is taken into account, still every building resides in its own Umwelt. Even though it's drawn in perspective, it's not connectable by any infinite lines. And of course, since she's here, I can't fail to use the word of Albina Yaneva from Manchester, who did very interesting 2 books on the making of a building and tried to build, using some of the actor network theory argument, a theory of what it is to follow a building, in that case a building which is a fiction of a building, in its own movement. So there is a whole literature that the building actually does not stand in res extensa either, for lots of reasons. First of all, because it's a project. In this case, one on the left is a project which was never built. But also because it's, even when once it's built, it's actually already in this duration, in this word that Bergson tried to tell Einstein had a cosmological dimension and was not a subjective way of adding subjectivity and style to something which would escape from the duration. Now, what is more extraordinary is that this technical project don't fit either into the res extensa. And there is a vast literature in history of technology, including some of my own work, and that's very surprising because you could say, okay, but at least technical projects themselves, since they have been drawn, they are actually at the source of so much invention into technical drawing itself, reside in this space. And we know this is not the case. Of course, it has been explored by in the interesting example of Ortega in the Biennale in 2007. But in a lot of work, I'm using, my own work of Aramis, because that's one of my favorite book of mine, is the story of a subway, an automated subway. And every time you study a project, you see that there is absolutely no place in the res extensa argument for what it is to be a project. That is a changing element, a moving, transforming element that change over time, and not over time, in duration, not in Einstein time, but move into duration, even though it's a mobile. And I've done a lot of work. This is some of the images of a transforming project. And I've tried even to find a way to draw this, the envelope, so to speak. And this envelope of a project, transformation, which is the horizontal line, and association, which is the horizontal line, and transformation, which is the vertical line, is drawing, it's an attempt at drawing something which is not the continuity in space and time in a Euclidean space of a Galilean object. Every one of us who is actually working on a project know that. We know it and we forget. We know it and we have nowhere to draw. And that's why I'm always keen on talking with architects, because since this is such an important experience, that we know a project does not stand in that word, how come it's so difficult to draw the movement, the envelope of transformation and association of a project? In this case, a failed project. Aramis was dismissed at the end. So that what we call actually an object is only a slice through this very strange geometry, which, you see that I don't try to rival your own skills at drawing and inventing visual element, but I would be very interested in the discussion if you can point out to me some of the way to draw a project, to draw in a Bergsonian way the transformative element of a project. And with Albina, and in the class we do on controversies, mapping controversy, we try, I mean, she has tried, and her student, many of these tools. And I think that's a very important element for discussion with the architect. And of course, not scientific practice. Scientific practice has actually nothing to do, and very little to do, with Euclidean space and Galilean space. And here I want to use an example from Simon Schaffer from Cambridge work, because it's a beautiful case. He revisited in a beautiful series of paper Newton Principia Mathematica, and he made just a very interesting research where this Principia Mathematica is supposed to be isolated from anything else. I mean, Newton barely get out of Cambridge, but he was actually related through a large network of correspondence to a large part of the work. And Simon drew, and this is just one snippet of his work, a large archive on all the connection, all the letters, all the travelers' logs and accounts and missionaries that actually Newton was poring over in order to get the crucial data for the Principia Mathematica. This is just one snippet from book 3 of the Principia Mathematica. So instead of having an isolated Newton, which is just inside Cambridge doing the theory of the whole world, there is actually a connection, there is actually a network, but you see it's very difficult to reconcile the res extensa, even though there was dispute between Descartes and Newton, as you know, and the network of practices inside which this res extensa was actually being expanded. And that's a very interesting point, which is also, but I have no time to talk about that, one of the key elements in Peter Sloterdijk argument in sphere waren zwei. In sphere 2, he has a whole long passage on this question of inside what the globe is actually being situated. This is another snippet from Simon's work. This time is a series of correspondence and logbook from the comets, the height of the tides, and the length of the beating of a pendulum. I'm sorry, this is in French. I should have put it in English. And in this paper, Simon tried to reconcile the two. Here on the left, you see the ideal of science, Descartes, and all the big guys with the angel working, pouring over the earth. I mean, sorry, the system of the universe. And this is inside the Chamber of Commerce here in London. And on the other side is, of course, and that's one of the great arguments of Simon, the whole scenography of commerce. How do you reconcile the two, the networks and the ideal of science is, of course, Simon's the difficulty of reconciling the two is what Simon has been after for so many years. Last example, but I think it's obvious if you have read Peter Sloterdijk, Darwin, von Uxküll, etc., etc., biological entities don't reside either inside the supposedly res extensa. And the point here, which is common to lots of his work, especially Sloterdijk and mine, and Whitehead, of course, is not that biological entities are a mix of primary and secondary quality, but we miss something if we treat them just as mechanistic material entities. No, the point we made, if I can put myself into Whitehead and Sloterdijk's shoes, is that it's not only that we add subjectivity, we need to add subjectivity to the living organism, is that we treat them badly if we put them in the res extensa. They don't live there. The res extensa is a utopia for religious element, which is okay, no one bothers about them very much anymore. For technical project, that's more surprising. For buildings, that's somewhat surprising for people who are not architects. For scientific entities and, of course, for biological entities. That's a lot of things we don't stand into the res extensa. So what is supposedly the universal place inside which the objects stand to be material, and then we can quibble about should we add or not subjective element, and then we can say it would be great if we had no subjective element, because then we would all agree and we would all be rational, like some of the eliminativists do in neuroscience and so on. It's exactly the opposite. No one lived there, and the extension of the res extensa is a rare phenomenon. In the history of a building, the moment when it's visible and actually manipulable as res extensa is rare. It's inside, very short moment inside the screen when you send orders, when you print, and of course it has nothing to do with the way you actually look at the drawing. It has nothing to do with the way you send the drawing to the people who are working there. And it has nothing to do with the way the building is seen, of course, and lived and deteriorate and is seen. So we use the rarest, smallest, most restrained definition of what is matter in order to define the rest of the universe. So it's not the question to say, oh, it's a pity because we have lost contact with subjectivity, we have lost contact with the universe, and so on and so forth. We human, I mean. No, it's exactly that. It's that we don't treat well the non-human, the matters of concern, when we put them into the res extensa. And that's a mystery of Western thought, as Whitehead said. It's a muddle. It's the muddle against which, as Whitehead said in another sentence, we should protest. So I've made the conclusion of part 2. Why do we believe we have to do that? Why do we have to is it, and that's really a question for which I have no answer, is it a difficulty of visualization? In a beautiful book called The Spell of the Sensuous, there is this argument that it's actually an impossibility of the way we draw. Is it the case? That's what I want to get from you, really. Is it the case that it's impossible to actually draw a matter of concern, and that matter of fact is just the way we draw inside this little very, very local site in which we have access to space? And again, don't misunderstand my argument. This is not a phenomenological argument about adding the lived word to the dry and boring but real element of matter. It's a cosmological question, what the word is like. Well, for part 3, I have to try, why is it the case? Why is it the case that it's so difficult to make this point? And I want to use someone, I'm not sure you are familiar with his work, but he's a very important French anthropologist called Philippe Descola. He's professor at the Collège de France. And he has done a very important book on, which is fortunately soon, I mean, in a few years will be finally in English, which is a book that has tried to see and to partition ethnography. Using ethnography is a great ethnographer, one of the last ethnographers like Lévi-Strauss who could actually review the world literature on ethnography. And to try to understand how come that what he calls naturalists, that is we probably Europeans around here, treat the relation between humans and non-humans. And he has 4 categories, but I use only 2 because of time. And the best contrast, I think, to understand this point is with perspectivism. Perspectivism is the word which is used by another anthropologist of Brazil, you might be familiar with because he has published a lot in English, Vivero de Castro. And the interesting thing to contrast American perspectivism with naturalism is that in Amazonian perspectivism, all entities are sharing the possibility of being humans. So human is the default position. Humans speak and souls is the default position. A tapir, a jaguar, a toucan, a palm tree are humans when they come home, so to speak. Visually, when they have a body, they differ. But the default position is to have a human soul. So there is a human behind every of these entities. Of course, in European naturalism, it's not the same thing. And that's where what is so contrary to our experience is actually made alive. It's not that we experience res extensa, it's that when we do, because of the way anthropology, naturalist anthropology builds their collective, we do a very different partition. And I put Lévi-Strauss here because Lévi-Strauss is part of that. We actually separate toucan, tapir, jaguar, palm tree, the body of Indian. The Indians are moving a little bit in the history of anthropology, as you know, as part of nature. And the human subjectivity is part of culture. So the primary secondary quality is not just a philosophical argument, very obscure one from Locke to Wittgenstein. It's actually an absolutely central anthropological trait, but it's not a universal either. So there is an enormous difference between the way, sorry, I put the Indian here several places because the Indian is not yet very clear where, now I think it's here. It's more politically correct. But for Lévi-Strauss, of course, it's there. Before Lévi-Strauss, it was unclear. But this is entirely different from a perspective. In perspectivism, on the contrary, what is very, very bizarre is to have a soul. Sorry, it's to have a body. Bodies are different, the souls are the same. And it's, of course, probably you know that Lévi-Strauss made this very interesting point in one of his books, saying, while the dispute in Valladolid was about do Indians have a soul, the Indians on the other side in Pernambouc were at the same time running a very different experiment. They took prisoners, Spanish prisoners, and they put them to death into a big pool to see if they rotted. And Lévi-Strauss says, well, first, the Indians were more scientific than the priest at Valladolid, because the priest in Valladolid studied only books, while the Indians were actually doing a physical experiment. But the point is that the Indians were absolutely sure they had souls. The question is, had they bodies? The bodies make the difference in perspectivism. And in the book by Vivero de Castro, and of course in the whole work of Descola, they make a lot of this opposition between perspectivism and animism with the technical word, and naturalism. There is no universal destiny of nature, which is of course great because it saves the Indians from being in relation with nature. For Vivero de Castro and Descola, this is completely absurd. There is no nature to begin with. And that's great if you are interested in ecological question. The little difficulty in Descola's point is that we used to be a third category, analogist. In the 16th century, in the word of Descola himself, the whole European tradition was analogist, a third way of organizing the connection between non-human and non-human. And there is a big mystery there in Descola, and I will not try to solve the mystery today, because I think, again, it has a lot to do with art history and the history of painting. But I just want to make the point, because there is in Paris, in case you go there, sometimes Englishmen actually cross the channel, is a very interesting exhibition by the same Descola on the visual questions raised by Sferry. So at Branly, for a very interesting, very, very beautiful, small exhibition about the difference it makes if you are analogist, naturalist, or animist in the way you draw things. That's why I'm interested, of course, in this argument. Naturalists have a tendency to draw in a way that makes the continuity of the materiality visible and the differences in subjectivity visible. While, of course, animists will never even think of drawing this way. And there's a beautiful demonstration of the sort of visual element that the animist and the totemist, which is the fourth category, and the analogist would deploy. So there is, for people who are interested in exploring alternative ways of visualizing process, a great advantage into the argument that Descola makes with a fabulous anthropological scholarship on the constraint, the anthropological constraint which is imposed on the way we draw. It's true that if you are naturalist obsessed by establishing continuity of the materiality and discontinuity of the souls, you will imagine, you will highlight, you will foreground completely different element from the visual world than if you are one of the three other categories. Still, there is this mystery that we were allergists and we have stopped being it when we arrived in the Descartes time. So I want to finish this talk, which, as you see, is a bit either too vast or too disconnected, with three little experiments I found interesting in trying to interest you, because ethnographic literature is fine, but it's a bit far from the architectural centers of interest, to try to find ways in which we can learn or inhabit a rhythm, or a way of entering into this question of visualization of process and duration. And I come back to Saraceno's work, I mean, because I think it's a very interesting, very inventive visually element, as I said at the beginning, between networks and spheres. It allows a language, because there is a general language here which is made of elastics. And it's actually funny because when there is no guide, you can push this little, the elastics, and you see how they reverberate. And of course, they reverberate very fast along the networks and much more slowly along the envelopes and between. So there's a whole interesting tensors, and I'm sure architects, of course, know those things very well through the work of on tensorgrity and that sort of thing. But what is interesting here is to look for other ways of, and here this is really to launch a discussion, other ways to get into the visualization. How do we actually, is there a way? And of course, networks and spheres are two big different vocabulary to account for the global, so to speak. It's a local global, and networks have been used, and spheres have been used. And what I find so interesting here is that Saraceno demonstrates that the notion of sphere is it's just a network which is very, very tensely stitched together. So there is a transition between the two, which is not obvious when you think of networks in actor network theory, for instance, and spheres in Peter Sloterdijk argument. So the first example is work I did with Valérie November and geographers, because I think it's interesting to now use the way we deal with maps, and I think I sent the paper to the website, right, and if you are interested. The way we deal with maps has completely changed now that we actually Google it, arriving in the middle of it. This is the beginning. I'm really sorry. I apologize. So this was a demonstration which was not planned for technical. This is very boring. Sorry. The Indians are there. They appear and disappear. So I was interested in the, when I was doing this work on res extensa, and I saw the first Google Earth things, I was terrified, because we were suddenly going to begin to say, okay, now we know maps are drawn, that you need map cartographers, science studies, done enormous work on cartography and so on. We are going to be out of the zoom things, and the first lectures I gave here many years ago was about trying to find the zoom effect that Paris is actually made of, not panopticon, but oligopticon. And when I saw the first Google, I was terrified because it's so powerful that you really believe you are in the Euclidean space, which is just zooming on and off by the technology. But then, of course, suddenly you are surprised because you are there and you see a publicity for a Pizza Hut. And that doesn't fit the Euclidean space, no more than this kind lady who came here fit the Euclidean space of technological drawings. So, in fact, I realize, thanks to the work of geographers, that on the contrary, the way we actually deal with digital mapping, the way we just print little small things like that to come here, is actually a very nice way of escaping the res extensa scenography. And in this paper, we make just a few, a very simple point, that the way we draw is completely the mimetic ways of considering map is undergone, is destroyed systematically by a completely different access to the maps, which is now much more vividly visible in our experience by the digital map, which we call the navigational movement. And this navigational element, it was, of course, well known from the history of cartography, that you need to acquire the data, that you need to manage the data, and we are very sensitive to that now when you're on Google, because suddenly you see very little, you have very few pixels, and suddenly the next one you have lots of pixels and lots of publicity, lots of people adding their elements to it, which you had, of course, before in cartography, except it took years to add something to a map. You have a recalculation of data, which is immediate, which goes very, very fast. So you are, in fact, much more attuned to the technology of making the map accessible than you were before when you were looking at the map. Of course, cartographers knew that, but now it's our experience. We live in a more navigational definition of what the map is than before. The fact of printing out, and just the very interesting element which were always in the map, the fact that there are signposts for an activity, which was not visible before. So I think, on the contrary, Google Map, I'm not doing any publicity here, they don't need me anyway. The Google Map is a very powerful way of living, of allowing these two different directions, the mimetic definition of map and the navigational definition of map, to be lived through. So that, to the point where you can now actually see why it's reversed, that res extensa is now clearly for us the consequence of having the navigational map. As if it was reversed. Of course, common sense reverse the reversion, so to speak. Common sense starts with the idea that there is a res extensa, that there is a real physical territory, and that it's represented in the map. But that's only in one dimension, the only dimension, the mimetic dimension. When you navigate through the map, it's actually this movement which is visible. That the map, so the territory is the virtual image of the map when you interrupt the movement of navigation. And that's why the very way we use all this little printout, we add things, or we withdraw, we recalculate, or we are aware that Google has been forbidden to portray or to pixel some of this part of some of this other part, or has been sued in Germany because we had too many pictures and so on and so forth, give a very, very different feeling for what it is to be in res extensa. So even though the appearance of a universal look, as is, at some point you can see the whole earth as if you were God, if there is a God of that sort of visual display, which is probably not a good God. But, and then you move inside your little village, and then you've seen that the zoom is actually very, very, very plausible. The implausibility of this movement is also extremely easy to now experience. The second example is coming from a large body of work, which I've referred to you more than display, on mapping controversies. Again, the mapping of controversy, especially scientific controversy, which is my original field and a topic of collaboration between many schools now in different universities, there is a new feeling of what it is to navigate from the element to the collective, which is a very new digital experience, and which again is an experience in the screen. On the screen, we now lived through, this is a series of researchers who are working and inheriting from paradigm, that is paper citations and work and title citation, They actually inherit from beginning, from the bottom to the top. They inherit argument inside the field of complex physics of complexity. We don't need to get into the detail here. What I'm interested here as a second experience, second example of the experience of being in a flow, a duration flow, again because of the digitality, is the possibility that we didn't have before of shifting from the element to the aggregate and back. And that, I think it has, I wrote long papers on that, I think it has a very, very big influence on social theory. That the whole social theory was built upon the idea that you had to choose basically between the individual element, which was the ingredient, and then you had to shift if you wanted to take a zoom view upon the society or meso or macro level. But the experience we now have on the web is that the individual, and I should actually, this is a bad image because I don't imitate on the screen the navigation, but you see what I mean is that you can go from a blog to the image of all the blogs, and neither the individual blog, the element, nor the map of all blogs is actually very important. What counts is the possibility of navigating back and forth. So that the two ingredients of social theory, the individual element and the society, are becoming just stop point along a movement of navigation, which helps in some ways to get you out of the destiny, of the fate of social theory. And I think that's also a very important line, but we'll see in the discussion if it has. It has lots of other consequences in terms of mapping. See, here you move, I take just 3 snapshots. You now have an individual paper connected to the descendant and to the ancestors, and you can then move to the whole paradigm. An obsession of mine, probably, but which I think is slightly helped now by the digital technology. A third example, also from the, I mean, of course, it's the digital which allow us, for a reason I will say at the very end, it's the digital that interests me because it's where the artistic resources to counteract the perspective drawings are now available. And that's the work of a British artist, Adam Lowe, and some of you I know very well, and Factum Arte, which is the facsimile. And facsimile is sometimes a derogatory term, but you have to take the facsimile in the way I took the reenactment in the beginning of this lecture. And actually, reenacting or doing a facsimile is for me the same activity, one in theater or stage and the other one in plastic art. And of course, in architecture, you know that facsimile are everywhere. Notre Dame de Paris is a perfect pastiche of the original cathedral, a very imperfect pastiche, sorry, which adds a lot of things to the original cathedral, of course. This is well known in history of architecture. I'm interested in this work, well, first because I was part of it. This is a very interesting experiment in doing a second original of an original work. And again, I think I put this paper on the website of your institution. This is how it is in Le Louvre. It happens that Le Louvre, this is the biggest painting in the Louvre, it's a Veronese Nozze di Cana. It's framed. It has been robbed by Napoleon, like many other things, and the Italians are very crossed. They were very crossed at having this painting in Le Louvre. I'm taking this picture from the Joconde. So it means no one actually look at these pictures because they always look at the Joconde. On both sides there is a door for which millions of visitors, having read the famous book about the Joconde, are coming just to be taken in pictures by the Joconde. So no one actually look at this. I mean, very few people look at this amazing picture. But originally, this picture was in Venice, in San Marco, and in San Giorgio, sorry. And Adam Lowe, who was originally a painter, has built a whole trajectory to render possible to print again an original work of art. is printing entire Egyptian tomb. Is printing, so it's a second original, and you see why I'm interested in it, because it's again making it possible to take an object as part of a trajectory of a second original, like the reenactment is a second element into a trajectory. And this is what it is now. It is at the very place for which Veronese painted it, and for which Piranesi, I'm blocking here, Palladio, sorry, for which Palladio asked Veronese to paint it inside the refectorium of a monk in San Giorgio, and this is Adam Lowe looking at it. It's printed on canvas, and it is, which is the most funny thing, it is actually not protected because it has no value. I mean, not real value, even though it's beautiful. And I made the interesting experience here, and I think I make the point in the paper, that when you are here, yeah, the funny thing is that the Louvre believes they still have the original. So this is the first case in the history of painting of the robbing of the biggest painting where the robbed museum has not realized it has actually been robbed. The original is now there. And people, when they were there, when we opened it 4 years ago, were in tears. The thing is back, even though it's a facsimile. In the same way, the Bergson fictional reconstruction of a 1922 debate is an event in the history of philosophy, even though there people were not in tears, because the point is a bit subtle, I agree. But in the case of Veronese, when they saw that it was if they thought facsimile means sort of fake posters or something like that, there it was, completely logical because of the space. You see why it's there. It's framed exactly, the architecture fit exactly the architecture that was planned by Veronese and by Palladio. It has no Joconde in the other side. There's no doors and there is no frame. And it's on canvas and it's painted, even though the whole sequence of work to have it painted is actually digital. So what interests me, and here is one of the episode of this is an amazing artist, is that you have part of the Iraq work there that Adam has been founding, trying to find every museum which has the palace of a king. And this is a facsimile there in Madrid. So when you go to his studio in Madrid, it takes you to halls in the suburb of Madrid, and you saw all of this amazing piece of work which are being processed as a second original. Now, of course, the question, I'm not talking here about the question of originality versus fake. It's not a question of fake. It's a second original. Try to bring the first and the second as steps along the trajectory of a work of art. And it's this step along the trajectory which I think modify the three Ks I propose you for your reflection to shift the attention away from the way we usually imagine things moving in space and time constant. So it's really a big fight between immutable and mobile, where the whole technical drawing is you take the thing and you move it and you maintain the constant. But that's not the way things are. They last, they transform, they are modified, they have a trajectory, they have precisely what Whitehead called the passage of time, the passage of nature, or what Bergson called duration. And that's not an addition of our psychology to a world which was made of pure material element. It's the way, if Bergson and Whitehead and all these examples I gave are right, the way the cosmological principle moves on. And I'll finish on that, just to remind you why it has some bearing on the architectural. I mean, I think that you see why clearly it has bearing on architecture, but it has a political bearing as well, which is, given the weight and the constraint of the ecological crisis, it's pretty important that we modify our very definition of what is space and time and cosmology and nature. And that's why all the work, that's why I'm so fascinated by Sloterdijk, because I think he has invented an alternative really to that. And I'm interested in this history of visual art. And I'm also, I have to say, thanks to you, very interested in collaborating with architects, I mean, not all architects, some architects, on what it is to invent the visual vocabulary, which, if I want to make it a bit too grand, allows us to meet with Gaia, so to speak. Thank you very much.
Thank you, that was fantastic. I think we should start with the first question you had. Can we draw architecture in time? And anybody, any thoughts to that? No? I mean, my definition of that would be you can draw it, but again and again. So rather than trying to mimic the time within one simple drawing, you have to realize every step of the architecture at any moment and see not only the final product or the seemingly final product.
So you film, you make a film.
No, you actually realize every step in the architecture process is a realization. So the first drawing is as important as a final building, or what in traditional view would be a realized final building. But actually every step within the architectural process is a realization. If you change the point of view from the... I mean,
so you do a flip book?
Well, in
like
the end it could be one. Like, but it's more, at any moment in time you have to redraw.
I'd love to have a flip book. That'd be very nice.
I'm wondering whether the emphasis on the how we might realize or visualize the matters of concern is almost too optimistic, because I think that you might be underestimating the threat that it presents to architects to consider this new paradigm, inasmuch as the matters of concern are so open that the duration is terrifying, because it's beyond direct control. And so that as soon as you shift that from, whereas the matter of fact is comforting and something which one can sort of engage with, and as a professional even more so, because facts are what supposedly, or the knowledge of facts is what supposedly defines a profession, and therefore the openness of the matter of concern is the thing to be addressed first before how we might visualize that.
So you are less optimistic. But what about the whole process? Because I mean, you say several drawings. Of course, there are lots of books on the way architects draw, the way they use drawing, which has, like cartographies, absolutely nothing to do with the mimetic definition of a drawing. There are lots of work on the way architects photograph their own buildings. Of course, masses of literature on the way people use the building. So in fact, again, it's an experience which is everywhere. Why is it difficult to register it? And of course, every building, I mean, like the one in Albena's work, is actually the subject of a controversy itself. So, I mean, the normal state of affair is the controversy. So why is it so difficult to register? I mean, I understand professionally it's difficult to register, but here we are doing a speculative argument. Why is it difficult to register a process by which a building is a controversial entity? I mean, that's really my question.
I think that this is exactly the point, that because it is difficult, it becomes a controversy. And it seems that architecture is today engaged in a huge controversy and fighting this controversy on the wrong field. Which is the wrong field? Because architecture still tries to hold on to the object, to the thing that is somehow, we all know that it's not closed, it's completely open. Just, I think that when we, for instance, tell our students that the moment when the architect actually comes into the picture, into the drawing of a building, the entire transformation is already in place, it's already in motion, and it will continue far beyond the actual control and obsession with control. And my interest is not much whether we can draw the building as part of that condition, but whether we can engage architecture in a controversy and how maybe through drawings, through undoing the drawing, the controversy can become somehow more political, more engaging. And I see probably that some of our colleagues here are misinterpreting that openness. And probably, and this is, let's say, a question that I would like to ask you. How would you conceive the problem that everyone in this room is somehow perceiving? How are we going to do this, and what are the conditions? And you're putting
That's
this
the question I asked you.
No, how do you position this problem into your, let's say, general construct of, let's say, ecological approach? Is our practice one of the many practices that is trying to escape this issue? Is it a practice that is particularly stubborn in escaping this? How is it operating through your experience?
No, my impression is almost the opposite, is that precisely because architect is such a hybrid set of competences and the way it's schooled and so on, it is on the contrary, like designer and so on, extremely interesting site. And the reason I'm so fascinated by Saraceno's solution to the problem of spheres and network is because it solves visually, at least. I mean, of course, it solves nothing visually, the possibility of opening and closure at the same time. So it gives an interesting element to this very question of uncertainty. Of course, we know that every time you enter into a controversy, it begins to go in everywhere. And yet a vocabulary is possible, to invent a vocabulary for closure of controversy. I mean, that's what we have been trying to do in Making Things Public, an exhibition several years ago. Is there a vocabulary for introducing the dispute without, I mean, basically it's, can we be modern and postmodern simultaneously? And I think Saraceno is trying to find a vocabulary closed and open simultaneously with still a very modernist idiom, which is these elastic tensors, which is the same meta-language for everything. So visually, at least, I sort of see Saraceno as exploring something similar to the question we are raising here. But I think architects have a very privileged position. I mean, they are a privileged quandary, so to speak. They are in a bad state, so it's very good because they can. It's difficult. And you can't ignore neither the controversy, nor the closure, nor the object, nor the question of style, nor the question of money. I mean, you are in a terrible mess, and it's so interesting. And then you have this debate with the engineer, which is also a so fascinating debate. Again, where all the classical questions are. There's a man raising his hand there. I don't know if you can actually send. I don't know if I'm supposed to do that, but he seemed to be very intent.
Thank you. You spoke quite a bit about Whitehead, and there are two thinkers that followed Whitehead, both of whom framed a whole series of questions in very similar ways to the way in which you have done tonight, Gregory Bateson and
Right.
David Bohm. And both of them, interestingly, framed the problems in the context of an ecological questioning. And I could talk about Bateson, but actually I'll try and answer your question through David Bohm. Bohm was, for those of you who don't know, was a quantum physicist, stroke, philosopher, and he tried to answer this question through what he called the Rio mode.
The what?
The Rio mode, so
yeah.
the flowing mode. And he suggested that all of the contradictions that appear to arise with the problem of matter within quantum mechanics actually arose out of a way of looking at the world which was obsessed with objects and actually a language which was obsessed with nouns. And so the Rio mode became a project. Can we try to approach the world in the most simplest sense, he said, using verbs rather than nouns, so using process methods rather than object creating methods. And it would seem that that's a kind of way to answer the question, because in architecture we're all of our tools and processes are about creating objects. We have no time-based methods, although the objects we create are entirely time-based.
Are they Whitehedian architects? No, I mean, they are Derridian architects, so are they Whitehedian architects? I mean, at the time, is there? No, that doesn't exist.
Not that I'm aware of.
Are they Bohmian architects? No.
Just me, yeah.
Okay. Well, I'd love to see your studio. How you draw things in a Bohemian mood.
Yeah,
verbal.
Rio mode.
Oh, that would be very interesting. Thank you. Does the digital make any difference? I'm interested in that. I mean, is the digital a sort of reactionary back to the 14th century, or is it, am I right in thinking that it actually makes the thing move in a very different experiential, because there is a debate, of course, in the philosophy of the digital. And I don't know, I mean, you must have lots of different views on that, because you are always on screens, basically. I mean, not always, but a lot.
I think one of the points of the dilemma Jeremy was describing as well, this matter of concerns, is actually not described in the matter of fact. The architects, the classical architects, like the Fountainhead, it's like there's this building, it's in my head existing, and I have to transform it into that without any negotiation. And that's why the making things public became so interesting. The ideal image still of many architects is there's no negotiation. It's me transforming my idea into what is built. And obviously, by default nowadays, and always, you have the dilemma. You can't do it. Like, you have to negotiate with the engineer and so on and so forth. So the interesting bit is if you go away from the design of only a finite object, you need that as a driver, as a aim. But actually what becomes interesting is the design of the design process. At any moment you have the positive negotiation, which doesn't become a compromise, but something actually which has an after effect within the next level.
And the design of the design process is actually a set of software which have invented lots of interesting ways?
Well, I mean, that's actually everything you use together, and that you find realizations in moments in between to facilitate negotiation forward, rather than having the fear of not having a nice building at the end.
And you guys have invented design of design tools which are interesting for that reason, because that would be a way to be visualize.
There are many possibilities of this, and that it's more a method rather than a tool. But it's like how you actually at any moment can design something which is already designed for the moment of the after effect.
But are you talking about all the thing called participatory design? No, not necessarily.
Not necessarily. It depends on which moment and which stakeholders are involved. But I mean, that's quite a long discussion to have. But it's any more thoughts on this? How do you see the, just to the last bits, the possibility of the, now with Google Maps already coming into the next step of this kind of augmented reality? I mean, that's the whole point. I mean, the whole word in itself has so many contradictions. How can you see that developing?
I mean, I just alluded to this paper on which is trying to find the experience where the digital is actually reinserting experiential in spite of itself, so to speak, in spite of the zoom effect. And I'm obsessed, and I think architecture again is an ideal site for this difference of scale, where scale is not a property of the object, scale is a property of the navigation. And that's why the digital seems to introduce something new, which is not really encoded into the rather traditional material infrastructure, which is just perspective drawing renewed, so to speak. I mean, just accelerated and nice to look at. So this is why I like visiting architect studios, because of course there is screen and lots of other things like scale models and masses of stuff, which makes especially when architects are dealing with design and with ecological sites, a very topical, very important site for me. And in fact, architects in many ways science studies people just under another name. So that's what is interesting.
Great, thank you. I just had a question, which is more a question in terms of clarification. And it was vis-a-vis the first time I encountered your argument about matters of fact versus matters of concern. And as I recall, you used the example of the explosion of the space shuttle. And you talked about how this perfectly technically mastered object was, at that moment of explosion, this matter of fact was transformed into a matter of concern. And then use the other example of the discussion, the debates around the weapons of mass destruction within the United Nations as producing the sort of opposite transformation. And then tonight in your PowerPoint, one of the points was that matters of fact are always already matters of concern. And I guess I just was curious because in the my initial understanding was that there was this moment of transformation that was some sort of threshold condition that produced this.
Yeah.
Is that no longer the case in your thinking?
In the piece with the shuttle, what was striking is that people realized that it was a matter of concern after it had exploded. But of course, it would have been much better if they had had in mind before. Yes. And what I was struck is the complete indifference of people when it was on the launching pad, and the fact that at the end it was inside the NASA again. So I'm still obsessed by this question, which is the same as the process actually. A building is inside the institution that builds it. A shuttle is inside the NASA, and this insideness of the NASA is impossible to portray except in rare circumstances. After the explosion, everyone say, "Oh, it's a problem of the NASA." Ah, the shuttle was traveling in the NASA? Yes, of course it was, but no, it was in the sky. Well, it was in both. And it was traveling in the sky, and according to President Bush, if I remember, also in heaven. It had a strange idea. It had a strange idea that they were actually saved directly, like the Virgin Mary, going up in the heaven directly. But what was Bush? Bush seems very far now. Okay? So my argument would be now that the world is made of matters of concern, and that the matter of fact is a slight extraction, a simplification, or a very, very small insight. I mean, this is again the adjudication of the Einstein-Bergson debate. That's what Bergson says to Einstein. Your metaphysics of nature is inside my metaphysics of duration, so to speak. But I think the reason why I introduced matters of concern is largely because of the ecological question, where every single element before it's even made is already the subject of a dispute about, the rest of the ecology and law and so on. I mean, when I was doing Making Things Public, I asked Lauren Daston, the great historian of science, because we wanted to have an exhibit which would have called The Last Matter of Fact. And we couldn't find one, because she's very good and she has an amazing scholarship. So every time I hit on an object, plastic, she said, "Oh, no, but plastic, remember, every time it was a matter of concern. Legal questions, a long dispute in history of science, problem of engineering, and so on and so forth." And finally, I said, rocks, because rocks are always in philosophy the last thing on which you hit. Rocks. No, of course, rocks, she said. Are you kidding? The whole of geology is in dispute. There are thousands of questions. So, and our box was still empty. We had nothing to put as the last matter of fact. And I think at the end we abandoned the idea. Valerie has been doing this thing with me. And she found some very boring rocks inside Karlsruhe. And we wanted to put them then and made the last matter of fact. It's very difficult now to find a matter of fact. Everything you eat, everything you wear, everything you breathe. That's why, again, architecture is just at the right spot, because you are constantly dealing with things you think are fact and which become concern. And not only asbestos, everything. Tuna, red tuna. Red tuna. And every day in the newspaper we have to absorb the fact that the last matters of fact has disappeared from Earth, which is interesting. And then there is Gaia. Big matter of concern. So it's not a shift, it's slightly different. But the main point on just to finish on is that it's not. I use a Gegenstand versus Dinge of Heidegger, but of course not to say that things are badly housed. Scientific objects and technical projects are badly respected if we put them on the side of res extensa. That's my point. It's not a phenomenological point. Sorry.
Thanks. Yeah, I like your example of the Adam Lowe's work, but I'm slightly bothered by the way that you speak about that work when you talk about steps on the way of a work of art, because does that not inevitably spatialize the time of the work? Steps on the way of a work of art are like frames, in cinematic frames, which are not, in a sense, going to give you duration.
Sorry. Yes,
Yeah.
that's a very nice point. Yeah. No, I mean the work of art is this movement, and what's? Go on with your question. I might have mistaken.
No, I just it's a question about the turn of phrase, whether that talking in terms of steps on the way of a work of art is the right way of speaking about the work.
No, right.
Yeah.
Okay. No step. No, what I meant is that Adam, because of the way he builds these things, which have nothing to do with the facsimile in the fraudulent way, is actually reinventing a way to deal with originals. So the work of art is this extraordinary process, and I could have done the whole talk on this work because I'm going to be fascinated by this invention of having turned something which, because of a digital technology, looks like possibility of doing a second, a facsimile in the original sense of the word, as a transformative, a performance. Actually, is that word used, is that the second original is a performance of the first. And that's a work of art. And it's amazing care in the Factum workshop, which makes the difference between a poster, a double, a mere repetition, and a work of art. It's the whole. I think he's a great artist. I think Adam is actually a great artist, even though he never wants to be a great artist.
So your talk this evening extends the work insofar as you've reproduced the image again. You've reproduced a.
Except I'm not a great artist. I'm sorry. But what I was interested in the trajectory, and he's doing that with lots of different things. I mean, the Tutankhamun. It's very funny because the Tutankhamun tomb is not a very good original. I mean, they were so in a hurry; they did actually a bad job. I mean, the Egyptian not these Egyptians who did a very good job, but the other one before. But the care with which he is actually reproducing every single speck of dust of the present Tutankhamun's tomb in the Valley of the Death transformed into his facsimile as a second print makes it an amazing work, a work of art. So it's this extraordinary trajectory that transformed, which really, because there are several prints, again, it's like the reenactment, modifies the definition of what is a work of art. And I think that's why I think that's what he wants actually, is modify what is a work of art. Because lots of people says about, I mean, it's a pity because he was a great painter and he abandoned painting to do facsimile. It's so sad. No, he is a great artist. Reinvent what is a work of art, and I think that's what is. I should have, but he is well known here. I guess so.
Are there any more questions? No? Well then,
Thank you very much.
I say thank you very much indeed, and please do not take another 12 years to come back.